In today's episode, I'll talk about two interesting stories. In the first story of the day, I'll talk about the new rules around recycling plastic and how they could potentially affect beverage companies. And in the second story of the day, I'll do a bit of a deep dive on municipal bonds and we'll understand everything that we can around it. Welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to traditional news channels. I'm your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Wednesday, the 5th of March. Look, as summer is approaching in India, big beverage companies like Coca-Cola, Bisleri, Parle, etc. are looking forward to boost their sales like they always do. And the logic behind this is very simple. People want cold drinks when the days get hotter, and that obviously naturally drives up the demand for these kind of drinks. But currently, these companies are actually facing a bit of a worry instead of excitement. See, from 1st April this year, a government rule says that every plastic beverage bottle that is sold in India must contain at least 30% recycled plastic. And every year, this number will go up by another 10%. And by 2028-2029, 60% of the plastic in these particular bottles must be recycled as per this rule. Now, on paper, I know this sounds like a great way to tackle plastic pollution because it focuses on something called closed-loop recycling, which is when old bottles get recycled in order to create new bottles instead of ending up as raw materials for things like roads or other products. Now, it is also considered the most efficient way to recycle plastic because it keeps turning one bottle into another bottle. And that means fewer piles of plastic waste lying around, which obviously is something that every one of us would want. But that said, there is also a downside to this. The beverage industry says that there are not enough recycled plastics in India in order to meet this particular requirement. Most of the country's recycling setup for PET plastic, which is the kind of plastic that is used in beverage bottles, is not geared towards making new food-grade plastic bottles. Instead, a lot of our recycled PET goes into textiles. In fact, some of your everyday clothes might actually contain fabric made partially from old Coke or even mineral bottles for that matter. Jeans are a great example of this. Sometimes they include recycled plastic fibers in them. But that does not really help companies that need new plastic bottles that are safe for food and for drinks. And one big reason for this gap is that food-grade recycled plastic needs to meet far stricter standards. Bottles that come from trash heaps can get mixed up with all sorts of waste. They need to be sorted properly and also cleaned thoroughly before they are recycled. Now, in our country, India, a lot of this sorting actually happens through vast and unorganized networks of kabadiwalas, which are local scrap collectors, rather than through advanced machines or systems. Our waste also often arrives at recycling centers in a very messy state, and this makes it very hard and a lot more expensive to process it into top quality plastic. And even if you do manage to separate and clean the plastic bottles, there is one more challenge at the molecular level. See, plastic is basically made up of long chains of carbon atoms, and when you recycle a bottle, those chains can actually break down, which becomes shorter over time. And the plastic that comes out of all of this is eventually weaker and is also more likely to leach chemicals or even let gases pass through. And both of these are serious problems if you need sturdy and safe bottles for drinks like Coca-Cola. And it takes a lot of investment and special technology to rebuild these chains so that they are good enough for food and drink storage. And that is why there are only a handful of plants in India that can actually recycle plastic into a standard that is safe for food. Now, estimates suggest that there are just 5 such facilities in the entire country of ours which are approved by the Food Safety Authority of India or the FSSAI. Now, these new facilities are supposed to cater to all of India's beverage needs if the rule goes into effect from 1st April. Industry groups say that these plants cannot come close to producing the amount of recycled plastic that is required for our country. India's bottlers together need around 1 million tons of PET plastic every single year. And this new rule insists that 30% of that plastic has to be recycled. So therefore, we are talking about needing 300,000 ton of food-grade recycled plastic. And the current plants probably can only provide a small fraction of that amount. And this shortfall means that in practical terms, there is no way to suddenly meet this requirement without causing any major problems in supply. Companies might even have to import recycled plastic if they are actually forced to follow this rule, which would go against the very idea of cutting down on plastic waste within our country. And all of this has of course led beverage makers to consider legal action because they are arguing that it is just not possible to follow this rule at such a short notice. But then there is also a deeper chicken and egg situation at work here. See, in order to make food grade recycled plastic, companies that recycle plastic, which is also the recyclers, need to be sure that there will be enough demand in order to justify the large investments in better technology and processing. Now, that demand can only appear if beverage manufacturers are required to use more recycled plastic. And yet, the beverage industry does not really want to rely on these recyclers unless the supply is stable and large enough to meet their needs. Now, of course, both sides are waiting for the other to act, and that creates a bit of a deadlock. Now, you might be wondering why these recyclers do not just build up new plants or upgrade their existing ones. Also, in India, the raw materials that these recyclers get, which is old plastic bottles, are really not sorted or cleaned properly at the source. Most of us do not really separate our waste very carefully, and municipal waste segregation is very, very weak in many cities. And by the time plastic reaches the recycling plant, it is so contaminated that it is very expensive to process for these particular plants. And transporting all of this waste around is also a massive challenge. India's logistic network, as we all know, is not really the best, and waste is heavy, messy, and not always really profitable to move along long distances. And on top of all of that, government rules around food grade plastic are still evolving as we speak. Before 2021, for instance, using any recycled plastic for food packaging was banned in India absolutely. But today, there are draft guidelines that recyclers must follow to produce plastic that can legally be used for bottles. But these rules are still not final, and that creates uncertainty for businesses that might want to invest in the technology. In other words, recyclers face an uphill battle of sorts on many fronts right now. Raw material quality, high investment costs, tricky regulations, and also tough competition from other industries like clothing manufacturers, which are also happy to pay for their recycled plastic but don't really demand such a high standard. Now, for beverage companies, using recycled plastic right now is a lot more expensive than using new virgin plastic. Some estimates suggest that it costs around 30% more as compared to them. That is a steep increase if there is no guarantee whatsoever that customers will pay extra for a drink just because it comes in a recycled bottle. So from a purely business point of view also, this switch is very, very risky for them. And all of these factors explain why nobody almost has made a serious move here. The industry and recyclers are stuck in their own corners. The government's new rule tries to break this situation by telling beverage makers that they must use recycled plastic, which would theoretically kickstart the demand. And once there is a large and steady demand, recyclers might feel confident enough to scale it up. But it's not at all clear right now that it can happen overnight, and the beverage companies warn that forcing it too soon could really create a lot of chaos, shortages, and huge cost increases. And at this point in time, everyone is waiting to see what will exactly happen next. Will the rule be enforced strictly? Will the industry manage to meet it by scrambling for imports or building up new recycling plants? Will the government make adjustments if there is a big shortfall? The true answer is that nobody knows this for sure. But what is clear is that if India wants to push the idea of a closed-loop recycling for plastic bottles, a lot needs to change, starting right from our dustbins at home all the way to large-scale factories which produce and also recycle plastic. This, of course, is a very ambitious plan, but it has run into very real challenges that will not really disappear overnight by the very structure of the situation that we have. With that, let's move on to the second story of the day. See, anyone that has ever lived in India definitely knows that constant feeling of disappointment of sorts when things are run. When a sudden downpour leads to a waterlogged street, potholes slow down traffic to a crawl almost, or civic services feel like they just cannot keep up. Now, one big reason is that India's cities have grown faster than the roads, drains, and other infrastructure that they depend on. More and more people are moving into cities, and official figures show that the proportion of India's population living in urban areas has risen from about 28% in the early 2000s to almost 36% now. And by 2036, it is expected to cross 40%. And all these extra residents obviously need reliable water, proper sewage, good roads, and decent public transport. These are basics that no modern city can of course do without. But giving them to everyone is obviously expensive. The central government even launched an urban challenge fund of 1 lakh crore rupees in the 2025 union budget precisely because city authorities are facing enormous funding problems. But despite that announcement, we still need to look closely at where the money for all of these upgrades is actually coming from. See, municipal bodies which run a city's affairs usually do not have enough money to even meet basic daily expenses, let alone finance big projects. They generally earn money in two main ways. The first one is through taxes or fees that they collect themselves, like property tax, parking fees, water charges, or fines for things like littering. And the other is from grants given by central or state governments, which is a little bit like pocket money of sorts that is handed over for a certain task. But sadly, both of these sources are very, very weak. Property tax, for example, could earn a lot more if they were properly reassessed and raised from time to time. But that, of course, is not happening. As for water or garbage fees, they sometimes are so low that they don't even cover the cost of providing these services. Now, grants, of course, are helpful in such situations, but the problem is that they are neither regular nor big enough. Another thing, according to a study by the RBI, is that all municipal bodies put together contribute only a little over 1% of India's total GDP. That is extremely, extremely small given how many people live in these cities and how much money is needed to maintain them. And on top of that, a handful of big cities like Mumbai or Delhi make up more than half of this overall revenue. Many other cities, including some with millions of residents altogether, have very, very little money to fall back on. So therefore, their problems keep mounting on top of each other. And this sort of creates a vicious cycle. Cities cannot provide good facilities because they don't really have funds. Residents, as a result, see things getting worse, so they are reluctant to accept any new charges or rate hikes. And that in turn squeezes the city's finances even further and puts them into a vicious cycle. Now, in order to break free from all of this, people began paying attention to something called the municipal bond. Now, a municipal bond, for your reference, is basically an official promise from a city government that if people lend money, which is by buying a bond, the city will pay them back with interest a little later. Now, it is a form of debt financing, just like how companies issue bonds in order to raise money. As of March 2024, the total amount of municipal bonds that was still not repaid in India stood at about 4,204 crore rupees. Now, this might look like a large figure to you at once, but it's actually only around 0.09% of all the bonds outstanding for Indian companies. And when you compare this to an advanced economy like the United States, where municipal bonds total around 4,171 billion US dollars, you will see how much smaller India's market is. But of course, the potential here is massive. Some people believe that if we focus on financially stronger cities, municipal bonds could really expand by many, many times over the next few years. And the proposed Urban Challenge Fund actually encourages the use of bonds by saying that it will pay around 1/4 of project costs, but also wants cities to raise another half from their sources, including municipal bonds. And this, of course, might nudge cities in order to try bonds a little more seriously than they are doing today. Now, in order to give you some very quick history, municipal bonds in India have been around since the late 1990s, when a few cities like Ahmedabad and Bangalore began exploring them. During those times, cities usually issued bonds quietly to private investors because there was not really a strong framework of regulations here. Then in the mid-2000s, many cities started to drift away from bonds because they could get money from a government program called the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, or JNNURM. So the obvious thought then became, why bother issue bonds when a major national scheme was giving out massive grants? But the thing is, that was always going to be a short-term thought process. In 2015, the stock market regulator SEBI introduced proper rules for issuing municipal bonds, which gave some comfort to investors. A few cities then picked up the idea once again. Indore, for example, issued a public bond in 2018 and later went on to try something called a green bond in the year 2023, which was aimed at financing solar power. Other cities like Pune and Hyderabad also have tested bond financing. But that said, municipal bonds have not really become a go-to solution for city governments. One hurdle is that many municipalities lack that extra money needed to pay back bondholders. Investors want to see stable revenue streams, and if a city can barely collect enough property tax or user charges, people can really become wary of buying its bonds. One more issue is that unlike in the United States, interest income from municipal bonds is not always tax-free in India. In the US, for example, that tax-free benefits makes these bonds very popular. But here in India, without that incentive, city governments really cannot easily offer high interest rates, so investors don't really feel that they stand to gain too much money. And besides all of that, there is also the reality that India's bond market itself is quite small and a number of municipalities don't really have the best credit ratings. The city's finances can be very murky with poor auditing or low transparency, so people aren't really sure if the city can eventually repay them. Also, many municipalities prefer short term planning and are scared of long term debt, which does not help in this case either. But still, all that said and done, there is definitely a way forward. If cities can get better at collecting existing taxes, especially property tax, by using better methods like mapping properties through satellite or digital tools, they could show investors that they have a strong flow of money. The government could encourage more people to buy municipal bonds by offering tax breaks for the interest earned so that the bonds become more attractive. One more idea is for multiple smaller cities to come together and pool their bond issues, which spreads out the risk and also makes bonds large enough to grab investors' attention. But besides all of these points, perhaps what is most important is that cities need to be transparent, show clear accounts, and plan projects very well so that investors can see exactly how their money will be used. Now, although municipal bonds are not really a magic solution to every financial challenge here, they could definitely play a big part in giving India's urban areas the roads, transit systems, and basic amenities that they desperately need right now. Indoor's example shows that it is definitely possible to raise large amounts from investors, and it is even possible to involve regular citizens in this process. So, in many ways, if municipal bonds are managed responsibly, they can help unlock the funds that have been proved difficult to gather through taxes or grants alone. And if more cities start taking this route, we actually might see a time when money is no longer the biggest roadblock and Indian cities can finally provide services that match the needs of the people living there. That brings us to the end of the two stories of the day. With that, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headlines. First, the Indian two-wheeler market showed a mixed performance in February 2025, with Royal Enfield and TVS Motor posting growth while Bajaj Auto, Hero MotoCorp and Suzuki Motorcycles saw declines. Royal Enfield leads with a 19% increase in domestic sales to 80,799 units, while TVS Motors saw a 3% rise to 276,072 units, driven by 24% growth in scooters and 34% growth in EVs. In contrast, Bajaj Auto's domestic sales fell 14% to 146,000 units. Hero MotoCorp declined 19% to 357,000 units, and Suzuki Motorcycle dropped 13.4% to about 73.5 thousand units. Second, the Indian government has upgraded IRCTC and IRFC to Navratna status, increasing the total number of Navratna CPSE to 26. Now, this elevation allows both companies to invest up to 1,000 crore rupees or 15% of their net worth in a single project without really requiring prior government approval. Now, this move grants them greater financial autonomy to expand operations, form joint ventures, and pursue strategic agreements. Third, Som Distilleries and Breweries Limited or SDBL has announced a 600 crore rupee investment to set up a greenfield brewery and distillery in Khimsepur, Uttar Pradesh. This would happen through its subsidiary Woodpecker Greenagiri Nutrients Private Limited. The Uttar Pradesh State Industrial Development Authority or the UPSIDA has allocated a 40-acre land parcel for the project, with construction set to begin after regulatory approvals. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care and goodbye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.